The air hums with heat and noise. Mechanics gather at the edge of a long concrete runway, their breath mixing with the oily smell of engines. In front of them sits something no one quite knows how to describe. A standard US Army Jeep, stripped down to bare essentials, with a rotor assembly bolted awkwardly on top. It looks absurd. A flying car built from scrap and hope. Officers crowd near the hangar doors, half amused, half bewildered. Someone mutters that the idea must have come from a children's comic book. Another calls it suicide. A few engineers stand silent, staring at what they helped create, wondering if it will even leave the ground. At the center of it all, a man named Hafner adjusts his glasses and watches the rotor blades begin to turn. He is British, Austrian by birth, soft-spoken but stubbornly brilliant. He has spent months persuading the US and British Army Air Forces that this ridiculous machine could work. They called it the Rotabuggy. Others had a simpler name, the Flying Jeep. The engine whines as the blades gather speed. Dust rises in the hot air, whipping against the soldiers' faces. The Jeep begins to move. Slowly at first, then faster, skimming the ground as if trying to escape its own weight. No one laughs now. A few years earlier, such an idea would have been dismissed outright. But by 1943, the war had turned into a global contest of invention. Every side searched for new ways to move faster, strike farther, and outthink the other. In the North African desert, Allied forces had learned a brutal lesson. Moving tanks and vehicles into combat zones was a nightmare. Planes could fly over enemy lines in hours, but the ground convoys that supplied them took days, sometimes weeks. Bridges destroyed, terrain impassable, roads under constant attack. A single destroyed bridge could halt an entire offensive. What if, engineers asked, jeeps could fly directly into the battlefield? The question sounded absurd, and yet in wartime absurd ideas often became blueprints. The US Army had already experimented with airborne transport. Paratroopers were dropped into battle by the thousands. Gliders carried troops, even light artillery. But a vehicle that could fly itself, then drive away once it landed, that would be something entirely new. The idea reached the right people. The Airborne Forces Experimental Establishment in England and the engineers at Wright Field in America. Men obsessed with machines that defied common sense. They had seen the British make wooden bombers and rocket-powered aircraft. A flying jeep did not seem that much stranger. So Hafner and a small team of British engineers began designing the impossible. They took a standard Willys Jeep, stripped away unnecessary weight, and attached a massive rotor system made of wood and steel tubing. It looked crude, even laughable, but on paper it could work. When towed behind a powerful aircraft, the rotating blades would provide lift, allowing the Jeep to glide like a gyrocopter. Once released, it could descend slowly to the ground, land on its wheels, and drive away. The first prototype failed spectacularly. The rotor shook violently, bolts snapped, and the Jeep nearly disintegrated during taxi tests. Pilots refused to touch it. "Death trap," one officer called it, but Hafner refused to give up. He reinforced the frame, adjusted the center of gravity, replaced the rotors, and modified the tail assembly to improve stability. It was insane. It was brilliant. It was America and Britain at their most desperate and most inventive. By the summer of 1943, the modified Rotabuggy was ready for another test. The plan was simple. Attach the flying Jeep to a bomber using a long cable, tow it down the runway, and lift it into the air. If it could stay stable for even a few seconds, it would prove that flight was possible. Engineers took their positions. The pilot, a daring young officer named Alan Marsh, climbed into the driver's seat. He wore no parachute. There wasn't room for one. He looked out over the runway, gave a quick thumbs up, and gripped the steering wheel as the tow aircraft's engines roared to life. The Jeep began to roll. Dust billowed behind it. The rotor blades blurred into motion. The crowd of onlookers leaned forward as the tow line tightened, pulling the strange contraption faster and faster until the tires barely touched the ground. And then, impossibly, it lifted. Just a few feet at first, then a few more. The shadow of the Jeep broke away from the earth. No one said a word. It would only stay in the air for seconds before descending again, bouncing once and settling back onto the runway. But in that brief moment, a ridiculous idea had crossed the line into reality. Raoul Hafner walked toward the vehicle, brushing dust from his coat, and smiled quietly. The impossible had flown. In the days following that short, trembling flight at Wright Field, reports began circulating through both British and American command channels. Some dismissed it outright. Others were quietly impressed. The official memo called it a limited success. But among the engineers who had witnessed it, the moment felt larger than it looked. A Jeep's simple, rugged ground vehicle had left the Earth. For a few seconds it had flown. That was enough. Raoul Hafner returned to England with renewed confidence. He presented his findings to the Airborne Forces experimental establishment in Hampshire, where officers and mechanics gathered around drawings of the strange hybrid craft. Hafner's pencil scratched across blue paper, sketching lines of lift, torque, and drag. He spoke quickly, his accent sharp, his enthusiasm contagious. He told them the principle was simple. If a glider could carry a tank, then surely a Jeep could fly on its own. The key was weight, balance, and aerodynamics. The problem wasn't the idea, it was convincing people that the idea wasn't madness. He faced laughter everywhere. At staff meetings, in newspapers, even from fellow engineers who whispered that Hafner's obsession bordered on lunacy. One British officer called it a waste of precious aluminum. US Army colonel joked that the only thing the flying Jeep would deliver to the battlefield was a coffin for its pilot. But war is not kind to skepticism. By 1943, Allied forces had one overwhelming problem: logistics. Every inch gained on the battlefield demanded an ocean of supplies. Men, weapons, fuel, and vehicles all needed to be moved, and fast. The Allied airborne divisions, designed to strike deep behind enemy lines, were crippled by their own success. Paratroopers could jump anywhere, but they landed with nothing but what they could carry. Jeeps, essential for speed and mobility, were left behind. Soldiers often fought for days, pinned down, waiting for reinforcements that could not reach them. The US military needed a way to deliver vehicles quickly, safely, and quietly. So they began experimenting. At first, engineers designed heavy gliders large enough to carry tanks. The British Hamilcar glider could transport a 7-ton light tank across the English Channel. But it was slow, vulnerable, and required massive tow planes to lift it. The idea of scaling that concept down, giving every airborne unit its own lightweight, self-gliding Jeep suddenly didn't sound so foolish. It was, at least on paper, the perfect airborne machine. It needed no runway, no heavy equipment, and no crew other than its driver. Tow it into the sky, release it, glide to a landing zone, and drive off into combat. Hafner's early prototypes, however, refused to cooperate. The first model, dubbed the Blitz buggy, behaved more like a flying rock than an aircraft. Taxi tests ended with shattered rotor blades and twisted axles. Pilots refused to touch it, mechanics begged to scrap it, and the military considered cancelling the entire program. Hafner begged for one more chance. This time, he rebalanced the weight distribution, moving the rotors farther back and lowering the center of gravity. He replaced the old steel fittings with lighter alloy joints, reshaped the tail for better stability, and redesigned the rotors to reduce vibration. The final version, the Rotabuggy Mk-2, was less a Jeep with wings and more a mechanical dragonfly. To test it, Hafner needed courage or madness. He found both in pilot officer Alan Marsh, who had already risked his life testing experimental autogyros. Marsh understood the danger. He also understood the reward: to be the first man to make a Jeep fly. The tests began again. At first, the Rotabuggy was towed behind a truck, bouncing down the runway like a stubborn kite. Then they graduated to aircraft Whitley bombers, their propellers roaring as they pulled the Jeep across open fields. The first successful lift happened almost by accident. The bomber accelerated faster than expected, and the Rotabuggy lifted cleanly into the air, its rotors spinning smoothly for the first time. Marsh steadied it, holding altitude as engineers on the ground stared upward, shielding their eyes against the glare. For nearly a minute, the Jeep remained airborne, controlled, stable, alive. When it touched down, sliding across the grass, the team erupted in applause. Hafner simply stood still, smiling faintly, as if he had always known it would work. In the days following that short, trembling flight at Wright Field, reports began circulating through both British and American command channels. Some dismissed it outright. Others were quietly impressed. The official memo called it a limited success. But among the engineers who had witnessed it, the moment felt larger than it looked. A Jeep, a simple, rugged ground vehicle, had left the Earth. For a few seconds it had flown. That was enough. Raoul Hafner returned to England with renewed confidence. He presented his findings to the Airborne Forces experimental establishment in Hampshire, where officers and mechanics gathered around drawings of the strange hybrid craft. Hafner's pencil scratched across blue paper, sketching lines of lift, torque, and drag. He spoke quickly, his accent sharp, his enthusiasm contagious. He told them the principle was simple. If a glider could carry a tank, then surely a jeep could fly on its own. The key was weight, balance, and aerodynamics. The problem wasn't the idea, it was convincing people that the idea wasn't madness. He faced laughter everywhere. At staff meetings, in newspapers, even from fellow engineers who whispered that Hafner's obsession bordered on lunacy. One British officer called it a waste of precious aluminum. A US Army colonel joked that the only thing the flying jeep would deliver to the battlefield was a coffin for its pilot. But war is not kind to skepticism. By 1943, Allied forces had one overwhelming problem: logistics. Every inch gained on the battlefield demanded an ocean of supplies. Men, weapons, fuel, and vehicles all needed to be moved, and fast. The Allied airborne divisions, designed to strike deep behind enemy lines, were crippled by their own success. Paratroopers could jump anywhere, but they landed with nothing but what they could carry. Jeeps, essential for speed and mobility, were left behind. Soldiers often fought for days, pinned down, waiting for reinforcements that could not reach them. The US military needed a way to deliver vehicles quickly, safely, and quietly, so they began experimenting. At first, engineers designed heavy gliders large enough to carry tanks. The British Hamilcar glider could transport a 7-ton light tank across the English Channel, but it was slow, vulnerable, and required massive tow planes to lift it. The idea of scaling that concept down, giving every airborne unit its own lightweight, self-gliding jeep suddenly didn't sound so foolish. It was, at least on paper, the perfect airborne machine. It needed no runway, no heavy equipment, and no crew other than its driver. Tow it into the sky, release it, glide to a landing zone, and drive off into combat. Hafner's early prototypes, however, refused to cooperate. The first model, dubbed the Blitz buggy, behaved more like a flying rock than an aircraft. Taxi tests ended with shattered rotor blades and twisted axles. Pilots refused to touch it, mechanics begged to scrap it, and the military considered cancelling the entire program. Hafner begged for one more chance. This time, he rebalanced the weight distribution, moving the rotors farther back and lowering the center of gravity. He replaced the old steel fittings with lighter alloy joints, reshaped the tail for better stability, and redesigned the rotors to reduce vibration. The final version, the Rotabuggy Mk Roman II, was less a jeep with wings and more a mechanical dragonfly. To test it, Hafner needed courage or madness. He found both in pilot officer Alan Marsh, who had already risked his life testing experimental autogyros. Marsh understood the danger. He also understood the reward: to be the first man to make a jeep fly. The tests began again. At first, the Rotabuggy was towed behind a truck, bouncing down the runway like a stubborn kite. Then they graduated to aircraft Whitley bombers, their propellers roaring as they pulled the jeep across open fields. The first successful lift happened almost by accident. The bomber accelerated faster than expected, and the Rotabuggy lifted cleanly into the air, its rotors spinning smoothly for the first time. Marsh steadied it, holding altitude as engineers on the ground stared upward, shielding their eyes against the glare. For nearly a minute, the jeep remained airborne, controlled, stable, alive. When it touched down, sliding across the grass, the team erupted in applause. Hafner simply stood still, smiling faintly, as if he had always known it would work. Late 1943. The airfield at Sherburn in Elmet, England, lay silent under a thin veil of fog. Engineers stood along the edge of the runway, their boots sinking into the mud, eyes fixed on the silhouette of the strange craft parked at the far end. The jeep looked almost alien. The rotor blades, wider than its body, caught the first grey light of dawn. Behind it, a Whitley bomber idled, its engines rumbling low like an impatient beast. For weeks, the team had fine-tuned every bolt, every wire, every section of the tail. The flying jeep had lifted before short hops, low altitude, brief and cautious. But today would be different. Today, they would attempt something new, a full flight, controlled from start to finish, at real altitude. Alan Marsh climbed into the driver's seat, his hands trembling slightly. He had flown autogyros and gliders before, but nothing like this. The cockpit of a plane gave you structure, instruments, familiarity. This was open air, an exposed jeep with a spinning rotor above, and only a thin seat belt between him and disaster. He glanced once at Hafner standing near the hangar, his coat whipping in the wind. Hafner gave a nod, not dramatic, not proud, just quiet reassurance. The Whitley's engines roared to full power. The tow cable went taut, pulling the Rotabuggy forward. The rotor blades began to spin faster and faster until they blurred into a shimmering disc above the vehicle. The Jeep bounced once, twice, then steadied as the air caught beneath its blades. 50 yards, 100, 200. The crowd held its breath. Then it lifted. Smoothly this time, gracefully. The flying Jeep rose behind the bomber, its shadow sliding across the runway like a ghost. Marsh gripped the controls, testing the rudder, easing the cyclic, adjusting his pitch. To everyone's astonishment, it responded perfectly. For the first time, it didn't fight the air, it moved through it. The Whitley climbed higher, towing the Jeep to nearly 1,000 feet. From below, it looked impossible. A military vehicle gliding through the English sky, its tires spinning slowly in the wind. The tow line shuddered, stretched tight, then released. The Rotabuggy was alone. For a moment, silence. Then Marsh felt the controls come alive in his hands. He tilted left, then right, maintaining altitude. He had never flown anything so strange or so stable. The Jeep floated with surprising grace, its rotors slicing through the air with a rhythmic hum. Down below, Hafner stared upward, jaw clenched, binoculars shaking in his hands. Marsh circled once, the air thin and cold. He banked gently toward the airfield, descending slowly, his landing zone a narrow stretch of muddy grass. He flared the controls, feeling the resistance of the rotors as they bled off speed, and the Jeep touched down with a bounce, rolling to a stop in a spray of dirt and snow. The crowd erupted in cheers. Marsh exhaled, hands still gripping the wheel. He couldn't believe it. The impossible machine had worked not in theory, not in a brief hop, but in real flight. When Hafner reached him, the two men didn't speak. They just looked at each other and laughed the nervous, exhausted laughter of men who had gambled everything on an idea and won. The tests continued through the winter. Each flight refined something: stability, control, endurance. By early 1944, the Rotabuggy could reach speeds of 70 miles per hour in the air and glide down from thousands of feet with precision. The British Army began calling it the Flying Jeep, half-jokingly, but the name stuck. Even the American press caught wind of it, though only in hints. War secrecy cloaked the project, but rumours spread that somewhere in England, soldiers were strapping rotors to jeeps and turning them into aircraft. To the public, it sounded ridiculous. To the military, it sounded revolutionary. The strategic potential was staggering. Imagine entire platoons landing behind enemy lines with their vehicles intact. Imagine supplies, ammunition, and communication gear delivered anywhere without needing airfields. For paratroopers stranded in enemy territory, it could change everything. Still, problems remained. The Jeep could fly, yes, but towing it required large aircraft, and its speed made it difficult to control in turbulent air. Landing in crosswinds was dangerous, and while it could glide smoothly, it had no power of its own. If conditions changed mid-flight, there was no going back. Hafner pushed for further development, a version with its own engine, perhaps small propellers or a lightweight helicopter rotor system. But the war was moving fast. The Allies were now focused on the invasion of Europe. Massive gliders like the British Hamilcar and American Waco were already carrying vehicles and men across the Channel. The Flying Jeep, though miraculous, was suddenly less urgent. Still, the idea refused to die. In February 1944, a demonstration was held for senior Allied officers. Hafner's team prepared their most stable Rotabuggy yet. Marsh, ever fearless, volunteered to fly once more. The Jeep was towed into the air, circled the field, and landed flawlessly. The officers clapped politely. Then one of them, a tall American general, leaned to his aide and whispered, "We might not use it now, but remember this day. That thing will change how we think about the sky." Hafner overheard him. He didn't smile, but he knew the man was right. The Rotabuggy never reached the battlefield, but its spirit outlived the war. Its principles, rotary lift, lightweight structure, flexible deployment, would later appear in helicopters, gyrocopters, and even the tiltrotor aircraft of the next century. It had proven that flight could be simplified, stripped down, made accessible. A machine built from spare parts and stubborn belief had taken off and landed safely more than once, and for the briefest moment, the laughter stopped. By spring 1944, the Flying Jeep had moved from rumor to classified reality. Hafner's team had logged multiple flights, each longer, smoother, and safer than the last. Reports crossed desks in London and Washington filled with cautious optimism. The summaries were simple. Concept proven, tactical value untested. Then came the arguments. Inside meeting rooms lined with maps and cigarette smoke, generals debated what to do with this strange invention. To one side sat the believers, the dreamers who saw in the Rotabuggy a future of airborne mobility, soldiers landing behind enemy lines with their own transport at the ready. To the other were the pragmatists, men of logistics and caution who wanted reliability, not experiments, on the eve of the greatest invasion in history. The Allied focus had shifted to Normandy. Every resource, every engineer, every hour now pointed toward D-Day. Compared to the gliders being mass-produced across Britain, the flying jeep was a distraction. It was clever, yes, but it carried only 2 men and a few crates of supplies. The Hamilcar gliders could deliver entire tanks. The Waco could drop a dozen soldiers. Why gamble on a rotor-winged curiosity? Colonel Harris Rogers from US Army Air Forces Logistics summed it up in one dry sentence. We already have vehicles that drive and aircraft that fly. We do not require one that attempts both. Yet not everyone agreed. Young officers returning from North Africa and Sicily remembered how airborne units had suffered without vehicles. They sent memos up the chain. If we had flying jeeps, we'd never wait for relief again. Somewhere between those two opinions, the project lingered, alive but drifting. At Sherburne in Elmet, Hafner continued testing, gathering more data. He replaced the wooden rotor blades with composite laminates, improved the tow hook design, and reinforced the landing gear. The Rotabuggy could now be lifted to 3,000 feet and released safely. Marsh performed barrel turns, shallow dives, even touch-and-go landings. The engineers recorded everything on 16mm film, their breath visible in the cold air as they shouted over the roar of the Whitley engines. The footage would later astonish skeptics. The jeep, tiny against the clouds, banked and glided like a bird. Its landing was smooth, almost elegant. For a moment, disbelief gave way to admiration. When the reels reached London, an Air Ministry committee screened them in a dark room. As the projector clicked, officers leaned forward in silence. When the lights came up, no one laughed. Still, the conclusion was predictable. Promising, not essential. The war's momentum had turned. The Allies now possessed fleets of C-47 transport aircraft and dependable gliders. Fuel logistics, not ingenuity, would decide the next phase of the conflict. The Rotabuggy, once seen as a miracle of improvisation, was quietly moved to the deferred development list. Hafner read the memo without surprise. He had fought bureaucracy before. What mattered to him was that it had flown, that an ordinary jeep, given wings, had lifted itself into history. In his notebook he scribbled one line. Proof achieved. Application awaits another time. That time would come, though not for decades. In the closing months of the war, helicopter prototypes began appearing in American test fields, the Sikorsky R-4, the Bell 47 machines that took off vertically, hovered and landed anywhere. Their engineers cited Hafner's data, his rotor calculations, even the stress diagrams from the Rotabuggy project. The flying jeep had not been a failure, it had been a bridge. By mid-1944, the program was officially shelved. The prototype was towed into a hangar, its rotors dismantled, its tires deflated. Dust settled on the body that had once soared through English skies. Marsh moved on to other aircraft tests. Hafner accepted a new post with the Ministry of Supply, helping develop helicopters for civilian use. The flying jeep became a rumor again, a half-remembered story engineers told each other after long nights in the lab. "Did you know they once made a jeep that flew?" someone would say. And it worked. Few believed it. But somewhere in an archive on a strip of faded film, the proof remained a jeep with rotors, airborne against a pale English sky, turning gently before touching back down. The laughter had ended. The disbelief had turned to quiet respect. 1945 Europe burns itself to silence. The factories that once built weapons begin turning to peace. Engineers pack their drawings into folders and go home. Somewhere in a hangar at Sherburne in Elmet, the Rotabuggy gathers dust beneath a tarpaulin, its rotors stacked neatly beside the frame. War had ended the way wars often do, not with innovation, but with exhaustion. Projects like Hafner's flying jeep no longer mattered. The generals who once argued for or against it had new tasks. Reconstruction, demobilization, the long paperwork of victory. No one had time for a jeep that flew. Yet in quiet corners of laboratories and design offices, the idea refused to die. Hafner himself stayed in Britain. In 1946, he joined the Ministry of Supply's helicopter program, helping design the Bristol Sycamore, the first British helicopter to enter service. His notebooks from the Rotabuggy tests pages filled with hand-drawn rotor diagrams and stress calculations were now reference material for engineers half his age. Across the Atlantic, American engineers at Bell Aircraft and Sikorsky requested copies of the British test data. They studied Hafner's balancing system, his lightweight frame design, the way he had converted ground stability into aerial control. Much of it appeared years later in the Bell 47, the helicopter that would become a global icon. The flying Jeep had never been a production vehicle, but its principles had slipped quietly into the machines that followed. In 1947, a young aviation journalist visited Sherburne in Elmet while researching post-war technology. He found the old hangar still standing. Inside, under a blanket of dust, sat the remains of the Rotabuggy. The Jeep's tires were cracked, its paint faded, the wooden rotor hub warped by years of damp air. The journalist took a single photograph and filed it away. Decades later, that image would resurface in museums and books, proof that the flying Jeep had not been a myth. By then, Hafner had moved on again to tilt-rotor experiments, to autogyros, to the dream of vertical flight. He rarely spoke of the Rotabuggy. When asked, he would smile and say, "It was a good idea at the wrong time." But history has a way of circling back. In the 1950s, as the Cold War hardened, the US Army began searching for small, mobile aircraft capable of delivering troops and light vehicles quickly. Engineers revisited the old concept files marked Rotabuggy Confidential. They ran wing tunnel tests on scaled models and compared them with early helicopter prototypes. The data matched surprisingly well. The Jeep's drag profile, its control response, its landing tolerance all predicted the performance of rotary wing craft then entering production. The forgotten experiment had been right all along. By the 1960s, the era of vertical lift had arrived. Helicopters like the Huey and the Chinook were doing exactly what Hafner had imagined, carrying men and vehicles directly into combat zones, bypassing terrain and roads entirely. None of those machines looked like his ungainly flying Jeep, yet their lineage traced back to the same question, asked in 1943. What if we could make a vehicle that drives and flies? Even in popular culture, the idea lingered. Comic books and pulp magazines printed illustrations of Jeeps with wings, calling them America's secret weapon. The public never knew they had actually existed. In 1970, a surviving section of the original Rotabuggy's rotor assembly was rediscovered in a warehouse near Farnborough. The Royal Air Force Museum restored it and placed it in storage, labeling it simply Experimental Gyro Jeep 1943. No fanfare, no ceremony, just a small note beside a machine that had once embodied impossible ambition. Historians would later call the Rotabuggy a failure that succeeded. It never entered combat, never received a serial number, never rolled off an assembly line. But it had proven something larger, that imagination is a form of engineering. When the modern tilt-rotor V-22 Osprey took its first flight in 1989, one aviation writer opened his article with a single line: "Raoul Hafner's Jeep has finally returned to the sky." He wasn't wrong. The dream had simply waited 45 years for technology to catch up. In the quiet halls of the RAF Museum today, visitors occasionally walk past a faded photograph on the wall, a small Jeep suspended beneath a spinning rotor, wheels dangling mid-flight over an English airfield. Few stop to look. Fewer still realize what it represents. A group of engineers once laughed when the idea was first proposed. They said it would never work. But one man kept drawing, one pilot kept flying, and one machine for a few seconds in 1943 proved them all wrong. The Jeep that wasn't supposed to fly did. And that, perhaps, is the purest kind of miracle engineering can offer. The war had ended, but the dream of the flying Jeep refused to die. In the late 1940s, America found itself in a new kind of conflict, one fought not with front lines, but with imagination. Factories that once built bombers now built peacetime prototypes. Engineers who had spent the war racing to out-invent the enemy suddenly had time to ask an entirely different question: what comes next? At Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, the same runways that had once tested the Rotabuggy now hosted a new generation of aircraft. Experimental jets screamed into the air, helicopters hovered for the first time, and test pilots whispered the same words their predecessors had. What if it works? Files labeled Gyro Jeep Hafner 1943 were quietly declassified. American designers pored over the notes. They saw what Hafner had done, not simply lift a jeep, but rethink the way machines move through space. The Rotabuggy wasn't just about flight. It was about freedom of movement, the ability to travel anywhere, land anywhere, and operate without infrastructure. That idea, once absurd, was becoming a doctrine. By 1950, the US Army and Air Force were experimenting with the flying jeep program again, only now it had a new name: aerial jeep or air car. Engineers at Curtiss-Wright, Chrysler, and Piasecki dusted off Hafner's logic and built prototypes that looked like something from science fiction. Small, open cockpit craft with ducted fans instead of rotors, designed to lift a single soldier or a small payload straight up and over any obstacle. They laughed again, of course. Newspapers called them men in lawn chairs. But the laughter didn't last. In 1958, US Army successfully tested the Piasecki Air Jeep, a two-seater ducted fan vehicle that could hover, climb, and land on rough terrain. Watching from the observation deck that day, a visiting RAF engineer reportedly said, "We built one of those once it had wheels." The lineage was clear. Every screw in that air jeep traced back to a jeep in England with a rotor on its roof. The Cold War accelerated everything. The logic of vertical lift, the power to rise and move freely, became central to global strategy. Helicopters multiplied, drones were imagined, and entire divisions trained around airborne mobility. Yet buried beneath all that technology was a simple truth born in 1943. That freedom in the air begins with simplicity on the ground. Raoul Hafner's name appeared again in technical journals throughout the 1950s. His notes on rotary stability and gyro balance became required reading for young engineers. In one 1955 lecture at Bristol, he spoke about machines that are neither cars nor planes, but something in between. The audience chuckled politely, but sitting near the back was a young American exchange engineer from Bell Aircraft named Frank Piasecki. 10 years later, he would design the flying jeep that carried his name. History moves in circles. In the 1960s, the world watched helicopters dominate battlefields in Korea and Vietnam. They landed in jungles, plucked soldiers from rooftops, carried supplies across impossible terrain. Reporters called them angels with blades. None of them mentioned Hafner's jeep, but the DNA was their rotary lift, modular structure, rugged simplicity. Every time a Huey set down on a field and a soldier drove away in a jeep waiting below, it completed the circle Hafner had begun. By the 1970s, engineers once again reached for the dream of a personal aircraft, a vehicle anyone could fly. Projects like the Moller Skycar, the Williams Airlifter, and NASA's VTOL programs all carried the same echo. Each sought to merge the reliability of a car with the freedom of an aircraft, and each, in its own way, stumbled over the same obstacles Hafner had faced: stability, power, and safety. But progress never truly stops. It simply changes shape. Fast forward to the 21st century. The term flying car is no longer a punchline. Silicon Valley startups test electric vertical lift aircraft that take off from parking lots. The US military funds new VTOL concepts capable of carrying troops and vehicles without runways. Engineers at DARPA, the same agency that once oversaw stealth bombers and the internet, open files labeled Transformer TX. The mission statement reads, "Develop a vehicle that can drive and fly with minimal pilot training." Sound familiar? In one briefing, a project manager actually projected a black and white image onto the wall, a jeep with a rotor, mid-air, 1943. The caption beneath it reads simply, "Where it began." The room went silent. For a few seconds, engineers and colonels stared at the grainy photograph of the Rotabuggy. A 70-year-old idea had returned, alive again in circuits and carbon fiber. Today, prototypes like the Joby Aero, Archer Midnight, and Lilium Jet chase the same dream with batteries instead of gasoline, algorithms instead of courage. They promise to make flight personal for everyone, everywhere. Their creators speak in the same language Hafner once used: accessibility, efficiency, independence. The tools have changed, but the vision is identical. At aviation museums, the remains of the Rotabuggy sit quietly among gleaming jets and polished helicopters. Children walk past, barely glancing at the odd little vehicle with its stubby tail and long blades. They don't realize they're looking at the ancestor of every VTOL drone, every flying car, every dream that the ground should never limit us again. Innovation often hides behind laughter. People laugh at what frightens them, at what challenges the boundary between possible and absurd. The flying jeep began as a joke, turned into a marvel, and ended as a blueprint for the future. Its lesson endures. Invention doesn't always win awards or enter production lines. Sometimes its victory lies simply in having existed. When Hafner died in 1980, he left behind more than patents and papers. He left behind a question that every new generation of engineers still asks. Can we make it fly? In every humming drone above a city, in every tilt rotor on a carrier deck, in every sketch of a flying car on a designer's screen, the answer continues to whisper back, we already did. In every photograph of the Rotabuggy, there's a man standing just off to the side, his coat flapping, his hair swept back by the wind. That man is Raoul Hafner, the mind behind the flying jeep. He doesn't look like the kind of person who changes the world. He's thin, soft-spoken, more like a professor than a pilot. Yet without him, there would never have been a jeep that flew. Hafner's story begins long before the war. He was born in Vienna in 1905, fascinated by flight since childhood. At 19, he built his first working helicopter prototype using bicycle parts and piano wire. The local papers called him the boy who wanted to fly like a dragonfly. When Austria's politics turned dark in the 1930s, Hafner moved to England, where his obsession found new purpose. The British government saw in him what few others did, a mind unbound by convention. When war erupted, Hafner was assigned to develop rotorcraft technology for the British Air Ministry. He worked under pressure, with limited materials and constant skepticism. He knew that the best way to win a war was to move differently, to go where the enemy didn't expect you to go. The flying jeep was his answer to that philosophy. During the height of the project, Hafner barely slept. He lived on tea and adrenaline, cycling between the design hangar and the testing field. He had a reputation for gentleness, but also for unshakable stubbornness. When officials called his design impractical, he smiled politely and said, "It will fly anyway." Then there was Alan Marsh, the test pilot, who volunteered for something everyone else refused to touch. Marsh was 28, with the calm eyes of a man who'd made peace with risk. Before the Rotabuggy, he had tested autogyros and experimental gliders. He'd once crashed into the Thames and swum to shore with broken ribs, joking afterward that the plane landed first, I arrived later. Marsh understood what Hafner was trying to do. Where others saw insanity, he saw challenge. The morning he first flew the Rotabuggy, he knew there was a chance he wouldn't survive. No pilot likes flying something that doesn't want to be an aircraft. Yet he climbed in, strapped himself down, and signaled thumbs up. When the jeep lifted, Hafner's heart stopped. Marsh would later tell reporters, "It flew like a drunken bird, but it flew." After landing, when they shook hands, Hafner said softly, "You've just driven a car through the sky." It became their running joke. When Marsh saw Hafner the next morning, he called out across the hangar, "Raoul, I parked it up there, do you want me to fetch it down?" For a brief, shining moment, humour replaced disbelief. The impossible had become routine. After the war, both men faded quietly into history. Hafner continued designing rotary wing aircraft for the British government. His innovations helped shape the Bristol Sycamore and the Westland Whirlwind helicopters that became vital to rescue missions across Europe. He was knighted for his contributions to aeronautical engineering, not for the flying jeep, but for the ideas it birthed. Alan Marsh survived the war too, though his flying career ended after an accident in 1948. He returned to civilian life, working as an instructor for young pilots who would never know he once flew a jeep with no wings. When asked years later about those tests, he laughed. "It was the stupidest thing I ever agreed to do," he said, "and the most wonderful." The other engineers, the welders, the draftsmen, the mechanics went back to their lives. Some built cars again. Others joined the aviation industry. Many never knew their names would vanish from the record. Their signatures remain only in blueprints, initials scrawled in pencil beside rotor schematics. Yet it was their hands that turned Hafner's dream into steel and wood. In the 1970s, a small reunion was organized for veterans of the Airborne Forces experimental establishment. Hafner, older now, arrived wearing his usual dark suit and tie. On the projector behind him, someone played the original test footage, grainy black and white film, showing the Rotabuggy lifting off for the first time. The room went silent. The machine looked fragile, almost laughable, but there it was, floating above the earth. Hafner watched without expression. When the film ended, he said simply, "It was a beginning." A few seats away, Alan Marsh smiled. "A dangerous one," he said quietly. Hafner chuckled. "All beginnings are dangerous." They died within a few years of each other. Hafner in 1980, Marsh in 1984. Neither lived to see the helicopter's full dominance or the explosion of drone technology that would echo their early work. But maybe they didn't need to. They had already seen enough seen laughter turn into flight, seen imagination defy gravity. Today, their legacy exists in a photograph. Two men standing beside a jeep with rotors, both smiling at something just outside the frame. It is the smile of dreamers who proved the impossible for no reward, but the joy of being right. At the Raft Museum in Cosford, a curator once told a visitor that people rarely ask about the flying jeep. They look at it, they laugh, then they move on, she said. They don't realize that everything else in this room exists because of what those men did. The visitor nodded slowly, staring at the faded paint on the jeep's side panel. The letters US Army were still visible beneath layers of dust. In the reflection of the glass, the outline of the rotor blades shimmered faintly, a relic of flight frozen in time. The curator smiled. People used to laugh at it, she said, but you know what? It flew. And that was enough.